Keeping an eye on several wildfires burning around Oregon. First, the Cow Valley fire.
Crews are working around the clock to get Oregon's largest wildfire under control.
The Cow Valley fire, that fire is now 91% contained. It is now more than 133,000 acres. Fire officials say that it was human caused.
Fire officials say it is human caused.
This was started by a person, but the cause is still under investigation.
Hey guys, welcome back to As a Man Thinketh on NASA TV. So today I'm going to talk about some of what we've been seeing with these wildfires. They've been pretty devastating this year. I don't know if you guys watched our channel, but you've seen us travel through Jasper, Canada several times. That entire town pretty much was wiped out by wildfires this year. So the wildfires have been pretty intense, especially up in Oregon. There's something that I would like to just mention here, and that is, you know, a lot of people think that these wildfires are being caused by climate change or other factors, and that's why they've gotten so big in size. But the truth is that a lot of these wildfires are the size that they are because of, number one, invasive grass species that are growing on the plains and drying out, and you know, desertification, mismanagement of rangelands. But the actual cause, 80% of the fires are human-made. There was a guy in California this year that pushed a burning car into a ravine and caught 300,000 acres of land on fire. That's the Park Fire. If you haven't paid attention to that, it was just very odd. You know, he just casually pushed the car into the ravine on fire and then walked away. They've arrested that guy. I don't know if they've come out with a motive or what exactly he was doing, because it was just, to me, it's odd. People today in this country are doing very odd things. I mean, what kid all of a sudden decides he wants to become Lee Harvey Oswald? I mean, think about just the craziness that's been going on. It reminds me of that Aerosmith song, "Something's wrong with the world today. I don't know what it is." Anyway, so Oregon is very interesting to me because of all the arson fires that I have seen, I've never seen something so deliberate and precise in its planning as the Cow Valley and the Bonita fires. And although they're still investigating it as suspicious and don't have any answers, nobody's come forward with any information, I would like to draw some attention to this because it has completely destroyed some people's lives. And if you look at the circumstances surrounding this fire, you know, maybe you could help spur some people's memories as to any suspicious activity that went on out there or anything else. I mean, this is a very deliberate fire. What they tried to do there was deliberately burn out the BLM grazing lands in eastern Oregon, and it's pretty clear to me that that's what happened based on the information that I have read. And this is a theory, and you know, there aren't any answers yet to it, but if you hear what I have to say about it, you might agree with me, or it may just, you know, spark your curiosity and maybe somebody will have some information out there. So the Bonita fire and the Cow Valley fire, Cow Valley fire became a mega fire. They were both started between around 1 and 5 a.m. on July 11th. If I had to guess, I would say that the arson was in the area sometime the week before that, between July 4th and July 11th, and knew exactly where they were going to go to start these fires. They tried to light multiple fires, not just two fires, but multiple fires were lit along Bonita Road and Indian Gulch Road, right on either side of John Day Highway, which is US 26 in Oregon. There's nothing out there. These roads are, they're right on, kind of running along the northwestern border of a lot of BLM grazing land. But where both of these fires were lit in the vicinities of that, there was also cattle infrastructure for getting cows in and out of these lands, which makes it even more difficult. You know, if you have cows out there and the places where you bring your trucks in are on fire, you can't really bring the cows through the fire to the trucks. I think whoever did this was making a deliberate attack on the cattle industry in Oregon, and I think that there's a lot of potential motives that could have led somebody to want to do this. Real quick, if you do have any information on what started these fires, you can call 1-800-47-ARSON or go online to WETIP.com, and you can submit any information that you might have to those areas. But going back to these fires and what started them, they were caused by somebody lighting multiple fires along these two roads, Bonita Road, and if you look down into the Bonita area, again, all that's there is really some infrastructure for loading up and dropping off cows. And the same thing when you go up Indian Gulch Road, it's the same type of infrastructure that you see up there, some watering holes for the cows. And there's nothing else out there. These are very, very rural roads. But everything to the southeast of these locations, everything downwind, is BLM land, which is the Bureau of Land Management. That's public land. Over 50% of the state of Oregon is actually public land, which makes it an interesting rewilding project because a lot of the land that's in the state is owned by the United States government. So you can adjust policies to kind of recreate what that land has been historically used for. And we've seen a lot of that going on specifically within the state of Oregon. You've seen the National Monument Campaign down in Jackson County. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to protect our natural resources. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying that in Oregon specifically, there's been a lot of movement to try and push BLM land changes that would support more conservation, less grazing, less other uses, including OHV uses. I mean, you basically are looking at large swaths of land that a lot of conservation groups are attempting to rewild, and they put a lot of pressure on the governor. They put a lot of pressure on the Bureau of Land Management to try and bring these objectives around, which is what makes this particular fire very interesting to me. It's located in the Bureau of Land Management Vail District of Oregon, which recently went through a massive kind of replanning of how they're going to manage their Bureau of Land Management lands up in that region. In February of this year, BLM made rule changes pushed by the Oregon Natural Desert Association. This is an association that on their website, they show a lot of pictures of their volunteers taking down the barbed wire and rewilding. And they made those changes to its approved resource management plan, RMP amendment for the Southeastern Oregon RMP, which is located in the Vail District where these fires were. The Oregon Natural Desert Association is an organization committed to restoring natural habitat. And I don't think that, these organizations necessarily are the ones that are catching that. I want to be very clear on that. I don't think this organization has anything to do with these fires starting. But under these changes that were made under BLM, and this impacts about 4.6 million acres of BLM land. The new RPM provides management direction for lands with wilderness characteristics and provides management direction for livestock grazing areas that fail to meet BLM's standards for rangeland health and processing voluntary livestock grazing permit relinquishments. So the objective that this group is having is to reduce the amount of grazing that's happening in that area. And a lot of you have probably heard about the new agency-wide rule, federal rule, which plays a significant role in I think a lot of these changes, and that is the conservation and landscape health of land and the ability to actually assign these 10-year leases that BLM gives out to conservation groups or to an oil and gas company who just wants to put land into wild rest for 10 years or so. So there are these new rule changes at the federal level that have said that conservation is an acceptable use on BLM lands. And I did a video on this a while ago, last year, when they were making those rule changes. And then you have this 4.6 million acre district coming in and saying, okay, well, we're going to start taking into consideration these conservation uses, looking at the land when people voluntarily relinquish their grazing permits or their grazing permits expire. We're going to start looking at changing what is suitable and what isn't suitable for grazing. And the overall objective is to reduce grazing. Now, the BLM is not going to get rid of grazing altogether because they need it to manage this lands. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second, because I think it's important for people to understand how important these animals are when it comes to land management of these massive Great Plains and these basins. This is the known as the Great Basin of the United States. It's these grasslands are partly in Idaho, partly in Oregon, partly in California, and they've back when the Dust Bowl happened, what happened was the United States actually went in and rebought up a bunch of these grasslands, significant grasslands, and protected them because of what we saw happen with the Dust Bowl. So it was a conservation effort from the beginning. But what we recognized was that we can't turn all this land into cropland. It has to be used as grazing land, or we're gonna have significant issues like we did with the Dust Bowl. And so that's why you actually have this massive amount of BLM land between just a few states that's all been pretty much managed as grazing land. And it's overall a conservation effort. Without the BLM, a lot of this land was getting overgrazed, but with the BLM leases, they're able to kind of come in and say, okay, this is how much you can graze. This is the areas that we need grazed down. And they can use these animals to remove a lot of invasive species, or at least manage those invasive species. So the approved RMP amendment requires BLM to consider taking action in areas that are not meeting standards for rangeland health, even if existing livestock grazing is not a causal factor for non-attainment of the standard. So even in areas where grazing might not even be a factor in the area's degradation, they have to look at it and consider removing grazing. Clarifies that the BLM will not permit increases to animal unit months if analysis finds that doing so could cause negative impacts to other resources in an area where there is either no rangeland health assessment and evaluation, or if the evaluation no longer represents the existing resource conditions. If you notice, they're not necessarily talking about the resources of vegetation. They're talking about other potentially valuable resources. So that could be anything. I mean, they could be an endangered species, whatever. See, these environmental groups want to be able to put the BLM in a position where they can hold them accountable to reduce the amount of grazing. So they find that there's some sort of other issue that has nothing to do with grazing, but they can say, hey, well, in this rule, you have to restrict grazing. The new rule also requires the BLM to review the suitability and compatibility of livestock grazing use with other existing resources in the permitted area when the voluntary permit relinquishment is received. If livestock grazing is found to be unsuitable and/or incomplete, the area will become unavailable to grazing and the forage allocation will be made to another resource. What they're wanting to do is start pushing some of these uses to conservation resources. So a lot of the changes basically that we saw in this BLM bill were saying, hey, in this Vail district, we want to start pushing more land towards conservation. We want to put rules in place that are going to help us get there faster. And that's what they did. They put these rules in place and they'll get there faster. So why the fires? Why would somebody set fire to this? I'm not saying, again, that these groups are associated with the fires. I don't think that they are. But I think that when you see these types of ongoing battles over public lands in areas like Oregon, you do also experience extremism. I mean, normally when there's a lot of activism around something, advocacy, you do end up with some extremists. And I think that this was a very wise fire in its planning, in the fact that where it was started was right there in Cow Valley. Thousands of cows is what I'm hearing. Thousands of cows will have either died in the fire or have to be put down after the fire. It's had a devastating impact on the Mueller County cattle industry, which is probably one of the stronger industries in the state of Oregon. I mean, these are massive grasslands. You don't think about this stuff. because nobody lives out there, right? These ranchers are relatively underrepresented when it comes to politics and other things because it's such a remote area of our country. Why would somebody want to catch fire? Well, number one, if the land burns, the BLM will generally put a 2 to 3 year grazing ban on the land. So if you had a 10-year grazing permit and you only had a few years left, and you can't raise your cows because you don't have enough forage without that grazing permit, and that's going to happen to a lot of these ranchers. A lot of these ranchers depend on these grazing permits in order to feed the number of head that they have. So if all of a sudden that resource is taken away for several years while the land replenishes, then now you're in a position where you're going to say, hey, you know, I can't hold on to this lease anymore. I'm going to have to relinquish it, voluntarily relinquish it. And a conservation group can pick it up. Now, somebody who's smart, you're probably thinking, well, setting fire just destroys everything. But I think that most people understand that fires are a natural part of the ecosystem out west. They happen, and they have for, centuries. One of the largest wildfires out west was over 3 million acres a long time ago. So fires aren't anything new, and they're good for the ecosystem. They remove a lot of invasive species, and realistically, according to studies, a lot of the native species start to grow back within a year because of their root system. They have grown and evolved in areas with wildfires. Their roots go far enough below the surface that it doesn't destroy the plant, and the head grows back. I mean, that's all fact. So if somebody wanted to preserve an ecosystem and remove the invaders, as they would see it, the cattle industry, setting fire to it makes perfect sense. You set fire, they can't use it for 3 years. People are going to relinquish their grazing rights because they can't afford to hold on to something they can't use. And within a year, the land will be replenished with less invasive species, and it's all good stuff for the environment, right? Except for the massive amount of CO2 that was released into the atmosphere. But nobody's really concerned about that. What they're concerned about is restoring the land to its native habitat, to rewilding the land. The problem that I see with this is that there aren't enough wild ruminants to maintain that land. So within 2 years after that first year of all this regrowth of natural vegetation, you're going to start having invasive weeds again, building up very dangerous a fuel ecosystem for larger wildfires. It will end up creating a much larger safety scenario. BLM has actually considered trenching fire breaks through the Great Basin in order to try and have a better handle on when these fires break out. But you can't look at where these fires were started, look at their relation to the BLM lands, look at recent changes to BLM rules and the push for more land throughout the state. I mean, the Cascade National Monument, all of this is pushing towards a rewilding project across the state of Oregon. Whoever did this, in my opinion, did it specifically for the purpose of removing cows from that part of the state of Oregon, removing cows from the Owyhee basin where these fires occurred. But these fires were set on purpose. The sheriff's department has said that it's highly suspect that all of a sudden we had multiple fires light up along these rural roads. They lit up along the rural roads because somebody drove up and down these roads lighting fires. They probably scouted out the area ahead of time, or they were familiar with the area. And my guess is that the target was the cattle industry. Ranchers don't typically light each other's land on fire. I doubt that there was anybody who was that upset with the BLM rule changes, because BLM is still very committed to keeping grazing animals on the land. When you have these super dry desert type environments, these grasslands, the vegetation it's unable to break down the way it does around here where we have a lot of moisture. If the grass dies, it slowly breaks down out in the field. A lot of that requires moisture. In these drier climates, you need the stomach of the ruminant to be able to break down that moisture and spit it out the other end, essentially as new soil health. So without that, you're going to cause a massive amount of desertification. But there are people who, think that it's better off to not have the cows, remove all the cows, and just let it go wild again. Let the prairie evolve the way it wants to, even if it might be one big kindling fire. My guess is that this is somebody who takes all of this to an extremity, somebody who has gone so far down the path of advocacy that common sense no longer plays a role. Now, the Durkee fire, which is just north of this area and also in the Vail BLM district, that was apparently started by lightning. I've heard ranchers talking about seeing the lightning strike, running out to fight the fire, and that has turned into a mega fire as well. When you look at the regions of all of these fires together, that's a very large swath of BLM land and private land. I think the Durkee fire may have hit even more private land than the other fires. The other fires, were relatively remote within the BLM lands. There were some private lands that were impacted as well, but the Durkee fire, I think, has hit more private ranches and things, and that was a quote-unquote natural disaster. But this region of the country, I would expect to see some significant changes over the next couple years. And BLM doesn't have to let the land rest for 2 to 3 years, but they're probably going to let it rest for 2 to 3 years after these fires, which is going to dramatically change the economy and the cattle industry in the state of Oregon, which is a significant resource of economic means for the state of Oregon. So I'm curious to see how all this will play out. And I don't think, like I said, that these advocacy groups that have been pushing for these changes for rewilding and working on these projects, I don't think that they had anything to do with it. I'm just pointing out the fact that you have these groups out there that are advocating, they're bringing out volunteers, they're pushing these theories, and it creates, in some ways, advocacy in many ways creates rage amongst people. And somebody at some point along the line there said, you know what, I want to go out and make a difference. I'm going to make a big difference. So I'm going to set a bunch of fires along Bonita Road and Indian Gulch Road in Malheur County, and I'm going to burn up all this BLM land, force them to put it back into conservation, allow access to these conservation groups who want to buy those leases and basically remove cows from the land. Add on top of that this negative narrative that's been coming out of the mass media for the past decade that's saying, cows are bad, they fart, they burp, greenhouse gases, we've got to remove them all, they're destroying our planet. And suddenly you have a real reason for an extremist to go in there and wage war on our cattle industry. That's what happened. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out a motive here. But finding the people who did this and bringing them to justice, that's a whole other thing. Whoever did this has no respect for life. Think about it. They didn't kill hundreds. There was one rancher who lost 300 cows. They killed thousands of cows. And if they didn't die in the fires, they're going to die shortly after the fires because of, as you've probably learned from watching our video on the Texas wildfires, the cows that survive these things often have to be put down. They have lung problems. They have significant burns that they can't be treated for. There are a lot of reasons why these animals end up having to be put down. I mean, this was an absolutely devastating fire, especially where it happened, where there's so many cows, and it's such an important ecosystem to the industry. And yet somebody decided, I'm going to drive down these roads between 1 and 5 a.m., set a bunch of fires, and I mean, they had a perfect escape route on either side. But what we do know is that both the BLM and the Sheriff's Department are considering these fires suspicious. We know from reading their statements that multiple fires were set along these roads, which proves that there was an intent there. Guys, these fires were lit on purpose, and whoever did this was pretty strategic, in my opinion. I mean, if you look at, the approximate start positions along these roads, they were started in areas where they'd be running uphill, downwind, and it's had a devastating impact on these ranchers. It's had a devastating impact on our public lands. And it's going to change the way that those public lands are managed, probably at at least for the next 10, 20 years. We're going to start seeing a major shift away from resources that are managed in a natural way with grazing cows or ruminants, to, I don't even know how they plan on managing these conservation lands, but you can't let this stuff sit there for 10 years without having some sort of management practice, like ruminants eating the grasses and breaking them down, or you're going to start causing desertification. It could happen that quickly. It could happen within one conservation lease. So I'm a little concerned about what I'm seeing out there as far as the conservation leases with BLM, and hoping that BLM can at least marry those with some overlapping grazing or something. Something has to be done. You can't just let the land sit and rest. You can't go out there and take down all the barbed wire. This was an intentional attack. You can't look at the evidence that's there and say it wasn't. And maybe if we start considering the motives of the attackers, it'll help us find those who set the fire, or lead us to people who might know who set the fire. Because those people are dangerous people. They killed thousands of cows. They have absolutely no regard for life. An animal's life, a human's life, it doesn't matter to them. They set fire to people, animals, the whole dang thing. And like I said, we continue to see this disregard for human life, for animal life, for all things growing in this country. It is very concerning to me. It's like we have a generation of zombies coming up that just have a complete disregard for life, for truth. They don't care about any of it. And what we're seeing on the rise with that is this sense of evil that I don't even have words to describe. I mean, this isn't activism. This isn't politics. This is something else. I don't know what to describe it as. I don't know where it's coming from. But what I do know is that we need more people paying attention to it, more people looking at it and saying this is wrong, so that we can find out who these people are and do something about it.